Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made. Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubaar's Godzilla Palooza. Greetings, mysteries of the 20th century. I am Zazubaar, and welcome back to Godzilla Palooza. It's day 6, and today we're going to be taking a look at one of Toho's most classic Monster Rumble films, and it is indeed the first ever Monster Rumble film where we've got more than just two monsters fighting, and it's also the introduction of Godzilla's most famous and arch rival. Today we're going to be reviewing Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. The second Godzilla film to come out in 1964, right after Mothra vs. Godzilla. Now, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is very much so Toho's House of Frankenstein. And what House of Frankenstein was back in, I think it was 1943. I might be wrong. No, it was 1944. 1944. Universal Films released a movie called House of Frankenstein, which was basically a big crossover between their most famous movie monsters, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, and Dracula. And Ghidorah is very much so that film for Toho, in that it's a big crossover movie between their most popular monsters and a new monster. It's not quite as... maybe not as impressive as House of Frankenstein, only because House of Frankenstein was a crossover between monsters who were a lot more, how should I put this? They had a lot of novels and back films and lore to support the crossover that happened being extremely big and important and not done before. Ghidorah is only Toho's monsters, and that monsters they created. It's Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan, and it's not even kind of all their monsters. We'll get that kind of thing in a couple movies. But this is impressive to me because it's the first time we're going to get a bunch of giant monsters fighting each other, and establishes this as the only monster franchise that's going to do that, the Godzilla franchise. I can't think of another giant monster franchise. Gamera doesn't have it, Kong doesn't have it, where multiple giant monsters are fighting at the same time. In this movie, we have a 10-minute fight between 4 different monsters. We have Godzilla and Mothra and Rodan teaming up against Ghidorah, or Ghidrah, as he's called in this film. So it's impressive to me for that, because we're not going to get another franchise like this, but we're going to get plenty of Godzilla films that carry on this tradition. But this is easily one of the best. I feel like there are going to be future Showa films that try to rip off the fight scene in this film, in that it's a really kind of down and dirty kind of monster rumble, and that there's not a lot of flashy power to use. It's a lot of monsters beating the shit out of each other. And we don't get a lot of that later, and future films that try to do that don't do it as well. This is just really cool looking. And it's also really classic because, and I call Mothra versus Godzilla very defining for the Showa series, and this carries on that tone. But again, it's classic because it's that classic idea of a monster rumble, in that it's a bunch of monsters fighting each other and not just two. So it's classic for that. And also, this is the first time we've got aliens involved in a Godzilla film, which is going to become a big deal. And then a bunch of films in the Showa series a bunch of them are going to involve aliens. And this is the first Godzilla film to feature aliens in the plot, though surprisingly they're not the villains. They're actually kind of the heroes of the film, or the human heroes. But we'll get into that when I talk about the plot synopsis. But the other big reason why this movie is important and is ultimately so memorable is the monster the other three are fighting, Ghidrah, or Ghidorah. Ghidrah is easily one of Godzilla's most unique and memorable enemies because he's got 3 heads, he's freaking huge, he's nearly twice the size of no, not that big, but he's bigger than Godzilla. His wingspan takes up nearly the entire screen, and he just looks BA as all hell. And we don't really get other monsters that look like him. So he's very memorable for that, and also he's going to be the monster, probably, I don't know this figure for sure, but I think he's the monster that Godzilla fights the most frequently in the films. I might be wrong on that, but we'll see as we go down Godzilla Palooza. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the plot of this film. Again, as I said last review, I want to try and make these more brief. So basically, let's sum it up like this. A meteorite crashes into the mountains, the Japanese Alps, and but a science team is dispatched to take a look at what it is. There's also a bunch of strange phenomena going on. It's the middle of winter in Japan, yet it's the hottest winter ever on record. There's a massive heat wave. Also, there is a prophetess who claims to be from Venus, who is coming around Japan saying that the world is going to end, the world is heading towards a terrible calamity, which the meteorite is a big part of. But she also says that Godzilla and Rodan are going to come back, and they of course do. Rodan emerges from the mountains, bursting out of a volcanic mountain, and Godzilla arises from the sea. And also, at the same time, the Twin Fairies from Infinite Island are in Japan, kind of doing, I guess, public relations for Mothra. I really don't know what to say about it, but it's basically public relations for Mothra. And they're also part of this in that the prophetess, well, they're basically, since they're a little bit more respectable figures than the prophetess is, because this is a woman going around claiming she's from Venus, but they're there to kind of be asked, is what this woman's saying have any credence? But all they can say is that it's highly likely that Godzilla and Rodan are going to come back, and of course they do. And also, the meteorite explodes, and from it comes a giant monster called Ghidrah, a space monster. And as the Venusian says, this is the woman from Venus.
Venus. The planet Venus?
Ghidrah is the thing that destroyed Venus and made it a dead world. And that now he's come for Earth. We don't really get a reason for how or why Ghidrah comes to Earth, or, you know, how he got to Venus. Well, there's no indication that it's another alien race controlling him, but basically he seems to come there of his own volition. I don't know why he's bouncing from planet to planet in a meteorite. I'd love to know why, and it's definitely very interesting, but it's ultimately not really important, though it does lead to Ghidrah not having a lot of screen time, and ultimately, this isn't his most defining role. I feel like he's gonna have better appearances in films later. He has a really strong presence in this movie, but ultimately, I feel like he doesn't have a strong impact personally with the audience. Like, I feel like you feel his presence, but you don't connect with him really. And I know that sounds weird because he's the villain, but it's just, I think we don't know enough about him, and we don't see enough of him to truly feel connected to him, but his presence is great. Just to wrap up the plot synopsis, the Japanese military admit that there's nothing they can do to try and combat Ghidrah. By the way, this is one of the few Godzilla films where we don't get any sort of counterattack by the military, at least one that we see. We see the military evacuating towns and stuff, but we don't see them actually try to confront the monsters. The monsters are very much so on their own thing here. So Godzilla and Rodan both reappear again. They attack Japan. They start fighting. And during their fight, of course, Ghidorah is destroying stuff. But then Mothra comes to Japan at the request of the Twin Fairies, who were asked by the Japanese government to convince Mothra, to convince Godzilla and Rodan to all team up to kill Ghidorah, because they don't think they have anything in their arsenal besides nuclear weapons, and they don't even think those will work to kill all the monsters. So they figure we'll have them all team up and fight. So after an argument, Mothra doesn't really convince Godzilla and Rodan to join them, to join up and fight Ghidorah, but she goes away unnerved by what happened with Godzilla and Rodan, and goes off to fight Ghidorah by herself and gets her ass handed to her. Then, though, Godzilla and Rodan, seeing Mothra struggle, decide to turn over a new leaf and do indeed agree to fight for the Earth and fight against Ghidorah. We'll get back to that in a minute. After a very impressive and very lack of powers and more of down-to-earth punches and ramming and dinosaur-esque biting and grabbing fighting, Ghidorah is indeed not killed but undeterred, or not undeterred. That means the opposite of what I'm trying to say. He's beaten by the three monsters and goes off into space. And then, of course, we have a nice wrap-up, and Mothra goes back to Infant Island with the Twin Fairies, and Godzilla and Rodan are left with their new characters. And when I say new characters, I mean their new outlooks on life. We'll get to that in a minute. This plot is very busy. And what I mean by that is there's a lot going on in it. There are multiple threads flowing through this movie, and the thing that impresses me the most is the fact that that it's not a very convoluted film. We're not presented with too much information at once where we feel like we're on overload and where the characters can't come through the plot. Like, I feel like not only is the plot moving at a good pace, but also we get scenes of the characters being the characters. The movie is definitely a lot longer than I remembered. I haven't watched it in a while, but it's not a short Godzilla film by any means. It's it's typical Godzilla length, about an hour and a half long. Again, the thing with the plot that impresses me the most is that there's so many different threads running. We've got Mothra's story, we've got Godzilla and Rodan's stories building, we've got the Ghidorah story building, and we've got all the subplots with the human characters, and on top of all that, we've got a political and alien plot. We got a political plot with a princess whose name escapes me, but she ultimately turns out to be the woman from Venus. A princess of a small Asian country who's trying to be assassinated, or there's people trying to assassinate her, and her plane being blown up and her being saved by a Venusian presence or something. It's not really explained too well. Basically, they explain it as she falls into another dimension and that saves her from the plane crash. I don't know what the hell's going on with that, but whatever. She survives the plane blowing up. That's their assassination attempt on her. And then the assassins try to come to Japan and assassinate her that way when she's disguised as a Venusian woman. Or not disguised, she actually thinks she is the Venusian woman, but that's kind of her disguise and that the assassins don't really recognize her. And all of that's going on, and none of it really feels convoluted. At some points, you do definitely feel like there's a lot going on and not all of it's connected. But ultimately, in the end, I think it does connect pretty well into the overall story. And that you couldn't cut out one of these subplots and have the same well-put-together story. Like when I was watching this movie for this review, I was about to rip apart the assassination attempt. Like, I thought it was just a weird plot line that was unnecessary. And then I realized that without that, we wouldn't have as much human drama, that a lot of it would just be the monster drama. And one big thing that I've been praising with a lot of the Godzilla films I've reviewed so far is the human characters and how good they are. And if the human characters are good, the movie is better because we're not just watching a bunch of monster scenes with boring human scenes put in between them. And I feel like without the assassination attempt in this movie, we wouldn't have as much strong human drama. That assassination attempt makes our lead, Shindo, feel much more likable and heroic, in that he's trying to protect this woman who doesn't even know who she is, yet he knows, and is protecting her from these assassins. Well, he's just a Tokyo, well, not Tokyo, but he's a Japanese cop. He's not a military man or a spy. He's just a cop. And he's not even given the assignment. He just feels the need to. So he's really likable for that. Without the assassination attempt, we wouldn't have that. The assassination attempt doesn't connect great with the alien plot, but again, I feel like for the sake of the human drama, it's there, and it ultimately makes the film feel more comprehensive. The alien stuff is ultimately not in there as much as I remember. Like, there's not a ton of alien stuff going on. Basically, it's just this woman, this Asian princess is digging deep down into her ancestral roots and realizing that at one point, people from Venus came to Earth and basically assimilated with the human populace, and that she is a descendant of some of these Venusians, and that she has some of the future predicting instincts, and that while all this apocalyptic world-ending stuff with Ghidrah and the monsters is going on, she has to use those powers, and her Venusian personality comes out and she doesn't remember her princess life. And I think that without all that, it wouldn't feel as impactful or as comprehensive. And that's really it with the aliens. Ghidrah, yeah, he's a space monster, but nothing really alien about him is brought up. I mean, he's basically just a monster from space. And the Venusian stuff is not really space-like because it's part of Earth's past. So I like all that, and it's not a problem that there's not as much alien stuff in this movie. I'm just making an observation. I think it's interesting, but because we're gonna get a lot more sci-fi alien stuff going on later. So this film still feels a little bit more down to earth, like we've been having with the Godzilla films. Like, we haven't got anything wildly sci-fi yet, and even this with its space monster stuff still isn't wildly sci-fi. We'll get to wildly sci-fi in the next review. So I really like the plot of Ghidrah. I ultimately wasn't as invested in it as I was with the Mothra vs. Godzilla, but I still think it's good. It's extremely epic, which I really like the tone of this film, in that the plot has this very epic, a big terrible thing is about to happen kind of feel. Like, it ultimately really feels like a big crossover event. Like, almost like one we'd have in comics or House of Frankenstein, where there's this big, huge apocalyptic event that's going to happen and all these characters need to get together to solve it. And I like that about it, and it has that tone from the opening scene with these UFO watchers talking about how all these strange phenomena are going on, and they're thinking it's going to lead to the end of the world. And I really like that. And again, it opens the film with this epic tone, and it sticks with that throughout the whole film until the last half hour. My biggest criticism of Ghidrah, and this is Ghidrah himself, is the fact that he doesn't feel as destructive as he's cracked up to be. There's this great build-up to when he's appearing, and all this stuff about the world being destroyed. But when he shows up, I feel like not enough apocalyptic happens, and we ultimately don't really feel the gravity of the world's coming to an end. And I don't love that. I feel like there should have been more of a grim tone after Ghidrah showed up. Like, I really wanted to feel like the world's future is in balance, and I didn't get that from it. And I ultimately think that's what Sekizawa was going for with it, and he didn't quite make it. So that kind of bothered me. So with all that said about the plot, it ultimately is a really good plot. I didn't feel as connected to it as I felt with Mothra vs. Godzilla, but it's still quite good, and I'm really impressed with how many plot lines it manages to juggle and connect without feeling convoluted. So let's move on to the human characters / the actors. We get quite a few classic Godzilla actors in this film, but I want to talk about the human characters themselves first. Our lead Shindo is a Godzilla actor who's going to show up a few more times in the franchise, and I really like him, because he's this very... He's very similar to Sakai from Mothra vs. Godzilla in that he feels like a little bit of a downtrodden city cop who's, trying to make the city a better place, but he can't seem to do it by himself. And he feels very similar to Sakai in that regard, but I do ultimately like him and find him a heroic character. and he's a good lead. One thing I find cool is that we've got returning characters from Mothra vs. Godzilla. Yeah, we have the Twin Fairies again, played by the Peanuts, but then we also have Mirai from Mothra vs. Godzilla returning in this film. And he's, again, quite likable. He's not quite as three-dimensional or as, personified as he was in Mothra vs. Godzilla, but he's a returning character. So I like that, we feel like he's the same person in this film. He's still a man of science, and he's still trying to make the world a better place. I like the Venusian woman / the princess, but she's a little bit annoying. This is also gonna in the Japanese and English cuts, and that I feel like in both cuts, I've only seen the Japanese version a handful of times. I've seen the American version many a times, but I feel like in both cuts, she's really kind of annoying and kind of ranty. And I get that she's a prophetess; they're supposed to be ranty, but still, I find her a little bit annoying. And she's supposed to kind of be the big thing in the big plot element in the film that's going to lead to the world being saved, and that she makes all these predictions. Whenever she speaks, despite her trying to stop people from destroying the world, it's annoying, and I don't think that's what they were going for. I ultimately think they were meant to sympathize with her, so I don't like that she's annoying. I don't think it's the act. Well, I think it's both the writing of her. It's a little bit of stale writing, and also the actress's delivery is a little stale. Even when she's the princess, I feel like it's a little bit too typical acting. So I don't love that about it. She's not the biggest thing in the film, which is gonna lead into where I'm gonna come down in this movie. Whereas I think I don't love this movie. I respect it and think it's a good movie, but I don't love it. And she's kind of part of it because she's a little bit annoying and she has a lot of screen time, so she's a little bit of the problem, but she doesn't ruin the movie. She does her job, but I feel like they could have done something better with her. Ultimately, I find the characters to be very similar to the characters in Mothra vs. Godzilla. And I think that's just the fact that it was made so close together and Sekizawa was writing it again. And not that they're all boring and unlikable because they're so similar to the characters in Mothra vs. Godzilla, but I find I don't connect with them as well because I like Mothra vs. Godzilla better as a movie. And since they're so similar, it only makes me want to see those characters again from Mothra vs. Godzilla. And again, they're fine, they're likable, and they're relatively well-rounded. They've got plenty of comedy going on and seriousness and all that, but I feel like I don't connect with them that well, and I don't know. They're ultimately why I don't love this movie as much as I like Mothra vs. Godzilla, because the human characters, I didn't connect with them as much as I did with Mothra vs. Godzilla. So that's where I'm going to come down this movie in a little bit, but the human characters are fine, just a little similar. The actors, we get quite a few returning actors. Again, we have Mirai again from Mothra vs. Godzilla. We have Akihiko Hirata playing the police chief. We have Takashi Shimura returning for the first time in nearly 10 years, playing a doctor who's going to become a main character later in the film, not in the franchise, but he's a central character towards the end of the film. He's the guy who operates on the Venusian woman to try and get her the princess back and stop thinking she's a Venusian. And I think that's it. Oh, and we have Kenji Sahara playing a villain again, so epic. And he's different than Torahata. If I didn't know that was Kenji Sahara, I wouldn't be able to tell it was the same actor, but wow, Kenji Sahara is awesome. He manages to play two villains in a row in the same year, and you can barely tell that it's the same actor. He does stuff totally different with it, and this guy's a lot more straight-faced and dead serious and very cold, whereas Torahata was this flamboyant and charming and sly person, whereas this assassin guy is this, cold-hearted killer. And I love that. I love the part where he's talking about how where he's about to kill the Venusian woman with a knife, and he says, "This is the knife I killed your father with," and his delivery is perfect. Kenji Sahara is awesome. He's one of my probably top 5 favorite Godzilla actors, so I love Kenji Sahara. He's great in this. And again, it shows that he's a very versatile actor. I think that'll do it for the actors. Yes, I think so. So let's move on to the potential allegory and the themes of the film. I've heard a lot of deep analytical looks at this movie. I don't agree with a lot of them because I think a lot of them are reaching a little bit. I do think it's an interesting allegory that they're looking at. Basically, it's that Godzilla and Mothra and Rodan are all representative of different countries involved in the Cold War. Godzilla is America, Rodan is Russia, Mothra is Japan, and that they're all fighting and quarreling amongst themselves. Mothra is more caught in the middle than involved in the fight, despite her fighting Godzilla in the last film. But Godzilla and Rodan fighting and refusing to give up their rivalry over defending the Earth, I do find interesting. I think it's maybe coincidental, and that them being America and Russia does make sense in the context of the film, but I think it's ultimately a coincidence. And Ghidorah coming in, this new threat, who is stronger than all of them and that they have to team up to fight him, is China, who had just acquired their first atomic arsenal recently. I wish I would have read up on the historical events leading up to this film, because I wrote a paper about Godzilla allegory a few years ago back in during high school, and I wish I remembered, because I wrote something on Ghidorah in there about the Cold War allegory, and there was a historical thing building up to it. But that's I can see it. I just don't know if it's. I think it might be a coincidence. It's interesting and it does make sense, but it does start to fall apart in ways that a lot of solid Godzilla allegory doesn't, like what we had in Mothra versus Godzilla. If you want to take that from this film, I'm not going to stop you. I didn't take that from it. So the allegory is hit or miss. You can take it or leave it. I don't think having it or lack thereof affects the viewing experience. I still think it's a good Godzilla movie. I think the allegory is kind of, you could take it or leave it. It's interesting, just not entirely developed, and comes a little bit out of nowhere when people are analyzing it. So sorry, I know I'm the biggest overanalyzer ever, and I can definitely see all the stuff about the Cold War. It's just, I don't ultimately agree. I just don't think that's what's going on here. Again, Honda's a master of allegory. It's just, I don't know, it feels a little coincidental to me. Though Mothra being caught in the middle and not fighting is interesting if you're considering her Japan. This might ultimately have more to it than I'm giving it credit for, but it's an interesting allegory. I don't know if that's what's going on here. So again, if you want to take that from this film, more power to you. I just didn't when I saw it, and I had to read up on it to get that from it. So again, it makes sense. I don't know if the events in the film are building up to that. The theme is a little bit more strong and developed. I think this movie thematically is about Earth coming to an end because people are becoming more, they're not working together anymore. People are very diversitized and apathetic and hatred of each other. It's a little similar to Mothra versus Godzilla, but it's a little different here because it's more about the political stuff. But the big thing is that we as a planet have to come together to combat this threat. And I think this is where the assassination attempt comes into the story and the themes, whereas we've got this story of a political force trying to assassinate a young girl just because they want power. And I think that fits into the allegory in that these people are fighting amongst themselves when we've got this big alien threat coming. And this guy goes until the Kenji Sahara character goes until the end. I mean, he nearly gets killed by Ghidorah at one point, and he's still going trying to kill this princess. I mean, geez. And ultimately he dies in the end by Ghidrah's hand. So I feel like Ghidorah, and I don't think I'm reaching with this theme because there's a line in the film that supports it where Takashi Samura says, "Is this a test for us?" When he's referring to Ghidorah. And I think that that's where the theme of the film lies, in that Ghidorah comes and tries to destroy us. Can we thwart him by working together? And the answer is yes. All the people join forces together except these political assassins, and they die. They get killed by Ghidrah. And the characters who join together get to survive, and they get to save their planet by Godzilla and Mothra and Rodan representing the people of the world coming together. We've got these two giant monsters who have been nothing but hurt by humans. I want to talk about this a little more specifically when we talk about Godzilla's progression in this film, because it's huge. But to talk about it more generally, just as the monsters themselves, they all put aside their differences to come together to save the planet that they live on. And not only do I think that's a positive message, but I like how it's reinforced and isn't hammered on top of your head. Because like Mothra vs. Godzilla, it's a movie that works on two levels, the plot level and the theme level, and the allegory is debatable, but it's not as strong as Mothra vs. Godzilla is, but it's strong enough where I think it's still a good movie for that. And it's widely entertaining. So I think that's ultimately where the film's theme lies. Whereas that we have to all come together to save our planet. Otherwise, we're going to be destroyed, and that's represented by Ghidrah. And that's where I think the Cold War allegory can come in, but again, I don't totally buy it. So let's talk about the monsters themselves. Let's talk about Godzilla right off the bat. This is the movie where he gets the most character progression in one film. At the beginning of this film, he starts out as that badass, cold force of destruction who's just trying to take revenge on humanity, and I like how that element's brought back into it. In that Godzilla and Rodan are both hated by humans. Humans are always trying to kill them, and made them what they are. They turn them into monsters. So Godzilla and Rodan are constantly trying to get revenge on them for that. So when we have this other bigger force that comes in and is just trying to destroy the Earth, they have to put aside their differences to save the world. And to talk specifically about Godzilla, this is a monster who was basically turned into a monster by humanity's lust for power with A-bombs, and now has to save them. That's hard for him, and he ultimately does. He hesitates, but he does it. And that turns Godzilla into an anti-hero. He's not a superhero yet. We're going to get that in the later Showa series, but he's an anti-hero now. He saves people when he has to, not when he wants. Not that he wants to, he just has to. And it's a big step for Godzilla's character, and it makes us feel for him and sympathize on a level with him that we've never had before. So I love this movie for that. And it's so cool to have people translating what Godzilla's saying. The Twin Fairies translate the monster talk when the three monsters are talking about coming together, and translate it. And it's so cool to hear what Godzilla's saying, and a little bit funny. It's almost better in the American version, because there's this great line in the American version where the Twin Fairies say, "Godzilla, what terrible language!" I love that. In the Japanese version, that line's cut out, but it's still entertaining to hear what Godzilla's saying. I love that. And ultimately, again, it makes us sympathize with him and feel connected to him in a way that we never have before. So I love that. I don't have a lot to say about Rodan and Mothra, because Mothra is very much so continuing from her characterization, or her children's characterization, since this is the caterpillar, from Mothra versus Godzilla. So I don't have a ton to say about her, just it's good continuity of character. So good there. Rodan, he's a little bit, he's very much so like Godzilla in that he's just a force of destruction and just trying to seek revenge on humanity. He has a good rivalry with Godzilla. I like that him and Godzilla are just kind of natural enemies, kind of like him and Kong. But I feel like in the end he doesn't get enough of a personality in this. In that I feel like we don't get enough of personality from him. He's a little bit too similar to Godzilla in my opinion. I mean, I love Rodan. His first movie is brilliant, but I feel like his design and the way he how much screen time he has and how much screen time he has separate from Godzilla affects how personified he feels, and I ultimately feel like he's not personified that well. But ultimately, I think it's kind of good continuity with the original Rodan film. The only problem is that Rodan died in that movie. And I like at least how they bring up resurrections in this movie, how Rodan was resurrected by the chemicals inside of volcanic ash and all that stuff. And fine, I guess it's okay. It's a little contrived just to get Rodan to fight in this movie, but whatever. I'll buy it. His design is not that good. It doesn't look that similar to the original Rodan. I think that's a problem for making him personified in this movie. He looks a little bit too much like the same color as Godzilla. So when he's fighting Godzilla, it's hard to tell the two apart. And well, not tell the two apart, but just like their colors kind of mix together, and I don't like that. I like Rodan as a hot red because it makes him look different, and there's not a lot of other monsters that look like Rodan. So I like him better as that hot red rather than brownish black. So bad design there. Which will bring us into the effects in a minute. I just want to talk about Ghidorah quick. Ghidorah I like because he equals Godzilla from the first movie. He is very much so what Godzilla was originally, a cold, heartless force of destruction. He comes to destroy Earth with no reason and no emotions. He just is there to destroy, just like Godzilla was in the first movie. And I love that, and that he makes Godzilla realize his faults. So I love that, and ultimately I think that's why Ghidorah and Godzilla will become arch enemies. And I might be reaching here, but I'm a Godzilla fan, and I think that it's cool that they have this connection in that Ghidorah reminds Godzilla of what he used to be, so I think that's why he hates him. It's kind of like comic book villains and heroes who are kind of two sides of the same coin. And I love that with Ghidorah and Godzilla. So it's very fitting that they're arch enemies, and this movie makes a good case for why they're going to become that. But ultimately, as I said earlier, I feel like Ghidorah doesn't have enough screen time. He has a great presence, just not enough of a personality. So I don't love that. Also, let me just say this. I'm not going to go into too much depth about Ifukube in this review because I feel like his stuff is on the same great level of the stuff he was doing in Mothra vs. Godzilla. So I just want to say about him that his theme for Ghidorah is awesome and classic and is going to be used in the future and will be big parts of future Godzilla scores. Big reminder for me is this score will be very similar to the one we get with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah in 1991. So I love Ghidrah's theme in this film, so I love that. So I'm not going to say anything else about Ifukube except his score is great and his theme for Ghidorah is awesome and very unique. Let's talk about the effects in general. They're awesome. They're not quite as good as the ones we had in Mothra vs. Godzilla, but they are ultimately well done. I just feel like they're not as well done as they were in Mothra vs. Godzilla. Godzilla's design is ultimately the same. The head is a little different and looks a little less realistic and fearsome as it was in Mothra vs. Godzilla. I don't know if that's on purpose because Godzilla is getting more of a human personality in this movie and he's going to become more of a hero. I guess that's the reason the eyes don't look as angry. It kind of works for this material, but it doesn't look as realistic or as awesome as the Godzilla from the last movie. Rodan's design is bad. I can't call it terrible because it's just a bad design. And the effects on him are great. His flying effects are great, and the puppet work on Rodan and Godzilla is quite good when they're fighting. It's not as obvious or as poor looking as it was in Godzilla Raids Again. So I like the puppet work. It's better than what Zazubaar was doing in the past. But ultimately, I just don't like Rodan's design. Mothra's fine. The effects of her crawling in the ground are great. She's very believable as a giant caterpillar. And I love it when she's getting thrown around by Ghidorah and when she grabs onto Godzilla's tail. Let me just say this. That whole last fight scene makes the whole movie worth watching. Just saying. The effects are awesome. This movie is made for the effects, and it ultimately just comes together in one epic package. The story is epic, and the effects and monsters are epic, so that's ultimately why this movie works as well as it does. So that'll bring us into wrapping up the rating and how I feel about this movie and my recommendation. You have to see this movie if you're a Godzilla fan. There's no question about it. It's one of the most classic Godzilla films, and it's very defining for the rest of the franchise. It's ultimately ultimately not one of my favorite films, I'll admit, but I do respect it, like it, and think it's great. I just don't love it. I wouldn't put it on my top 5 or 10 favorite Godzilla films. I just think it's good and well made. I just don't love it. My favorite parts of it are Ghidorah himself and Godzilla's character development. That's about it. Everything else about it is just okay. The plot is great, just I didn't feel connected to it. The human characters are fine. I didn't feel connected to them. And I wasn't wholly invested in this film as I was with Mothra vs. Godzilla, and that's why I like it and don't love it. Still, you need to see it if you're a Godzilla fan. It's absolutely required viewing material. If you skip it, you're not a true Godzilla fan. It's classic, and is the birth of the monster rumble that we're going to get in later films. So, important movie, not one of my favorites, but it definitely is important and good, and you should watch it. I'm going to give it the same score as I gave King Kong vs. Godzilla. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's a good movie. I don't think it's a great movie. I do ultimately recommend it, just it's not the best Godzilla film ever made. Let me just say that. It's good, but not great. I'll briefly, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I'll briefly touch on the American cut. It's not totally different. A lot of it is just human scenes being cut out for the sake of the movie had to be shorter because it was being marketed to children, and as we all know, children don't have great attention spans. So the film is actually cut by a good like 10 minutes. So it's a drastic cut. It doesn't affect the plot. It's just the film doesn't have as many scenes. It's just very plot driven, not very character driven. And I don't like the American version. I don't watch it anymore because it's just. The Japanese cut's better and more comprehensive, so it's extremely plot-driven, and surprisingly enough, Honda himself prefers, not the American version, but the cut that's only barely an hour long, or a little over an hour, in that he cut the film down a lot for when he was airing it at a children's film festival, and I don't know, I don't know why he likes it shorter, but he cut it down a lot, and it's his personal favorite cut. So, interesting. I don't know why. I ultimately prefer the longer cut. But the American version is not worth watching. There's no reason to watch it. Just, the dub job is fine. It's a little silly. But the Japanese version just has more character stuff in it, so watch the Japanese version. But the American cut was very popular, and, I don't know, if you're a Godzilla completionist, watch both, but ultimately, just the Japanese version is better. So that'll about do it for Godzilla Palooza Day 6, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. So thank you very much for watching, and tomorrow, we're not leaving Ghidorah behind yet, because he's still got one more movie in the Showa series before the finale of the Showa series, or the supposed finale of the Showa series, and we'll get to that tomorrow when we review the first out there science fiction. There's actual aliens in the plot, majorly out there sci-fi Godzilla film, Invasion of the Astro Monsters, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. I'll see it from 1965. I'll see you tomorrow for that review. Sayonara.